Is there another man, Eleanor?" The question was not shouted. It was worse. It was delivered in a voice of polished ice, a tone Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, usually reserved for dismissing a valet or correcting a politician. It landed in the suffocating quiet of her London drawing-room like a shard of glass. Eleanor froze, her needle poised over a square of deep blue velvet. The nursery quilt was spread across her lap, a vibrant island of hope in the sea of gray silk and muted damask that was her life. Outside, the November rain whispered against the window panes, a constant, mournful sigh that had become the soundtrack to her marriage. She looked up at him. He stood before the hearth, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, a figure of immense power and devastating coldness. The firelight carved shadows across his face, making his handsome features seem like a mask of aristocratic judgment. He was a prize bull, she thought with a sudden, vicious clarity, admired for his breeding and his strength, but with no more warmth than the stone he stood beside. "What did you say?" she asked, her own voice a threadbare thing. "You heard me," he said. He did not move, did not even look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the sputtering flames. "I have been made aware of your indiscretions. A letter has come into my possession." A letter. The words made no sense. Her world had shrunk to this house, to the silent corridors of Blackwood Manor, to the secret she carried inside her. A secret she had been waiting for the right moment to share, a moment of softness that had never arrived. She had written no letters. She had received none. "I do not know what you mean," she said, her fingers tightening on the soft velvet. The quilt was her only real creation. Patches of silk from her debutante gowns, brocade from her wedding dress, wool from a riding habit she had loved, all stitched together with her own hands for a child he did not yet know existed. Each stitch was a prayer, each color a dream. In the center she had been working on the sigil of his house, a blackbird in a hawthorn tree, rendered in 1,000 tiny, intricate knots of black and silver thread. It was a pattern she had designed herself, a mark of her own making within his world. "Do not play the innocent, Eleanor. It is tiresome." He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes, the color of a winter storm, pinned her to the chair. They were the one feature she had once found beautiful. Now they were instruments of torture. "My cousin Marcus was good enough to intercept it, to save me from further public humiliation." Marcus. Of course, his cousin, with his sympathetic smiles and his lingering handshakes, the man who always seemed to be there, a shadow at Alistair's shoulder, whispering, advising, commiserating. She had always felt a chill when Marcus was near, a sense of being watched and weighed. She had dismissed it as her own melancholy. Now she saw it for what it was, a web, being spun around her. "Marcus found a letter?" she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "May I see it?" "No," Alistair said flatly. "I have already burned it. I will not have such filth in my house." The finality of his statement was a door slamming shut in a tomb. He had judged her, sentenced her, and executed the evidence without a trial. Her heart, which had been fluttering like a trapped bird, grew heavy and still. This was not a misunderstanding to be cleared. This was a verdict. "There was no letter, Alistair," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. "Whatever Marcus showed you, it was a lie." He laughed, a short, ugly sound entirely devoid of humor. "A lie? And why would he lie? He is my family. You are the woman my father insisted I marry to secure the Vance fortune. It was a transaction, Eleanor. I had hoped for civility. It seems I was a fool to even expect that." Each word was a measured blow, a transaction. He had never said it so plainly before, but she had always known it. She was a necessary component of his ducal machinery, a broodmare with a large dowry. And now she was a faulty part, to be discarded. The room was suddenly too hot. the air thick with the smell of beeswax and the cloying scent of the hothouse lilies dying in a vase on the mantel. A wave of nausea, so familiar these past few weeks, washed over her. It was sharp, acidic, a physical manifestation of the poison he was pouring into her soul. She pressed a hand to her stomach, a desperate, protective gesture. He saw it. His eyes narrowed. "What is this? Are you unwell?" For one wild second, she thought of telling him, of screaming it at him. "I am carrying your son, your heir." But the words died in her throat. To tell him now would be to hand her child over to this cold, cruel stranger who believed her a whore. He would think the child was not his. He would take the baby from her, hide it away, or worse. The precious secret she had been nurturing turned to a terrifying liability. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. "I'm tired," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the grand room. She began to fold the quilt. Her movements were slow, deliberate, folding the bright hopes, the soft velvets, the intricate stitching, packing it all away. "I will be retiring to Blackwood Manor in the morning," he announced, turning back to the fire. "Alone. You will remain here. My solicitor will be in touch to arrange the terms of our separation. You will be provided for, of course. Discreetly. The Duke of Blackwood is not a man to air his laundry in public. You will want for nothing except my presence." He thought it was a punishment, to leave her here, with all the silks and servants and silver. He did not understand that his presence was the cage. His absence was the key. She stood, the folded quilt clutched to her chest like a shield. It was surprisingly heavy. "As you wish, Your Grace." The formal title hung between them, a cold, dead thing. It was the first time she had used it since their wedding day. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, annoyance, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He gave a curt nod of dismissal, his attention already elsewhere, likely on matters of state, of finance, of anything other than the woman whose life he had just annihilated. She walked from the room. She did not run. Her back was straight, her head held high, the Duchess of Blackwood to the last. She walked up the grand, curving staircase, her hand gliding over the polished banister. She passed the portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes following her with the same cold judgment as their descendant. In her palatial bedroom, she did not look at the wardrobe filled with gowns from Paris. She did not glance at the jewel case on her vanity, where the Blackwood diamonds lay sleeping on black velvet. They were not hers. They were part of the transaction. Props for the Duchess. She walked through to the adjoining suite of rooms, the ones she had quietly claimed for the nursery. They were empty, waiting. But the air in here felt different. It felt like hers. She had chosen the pale yellow wallpaper, the white painted cot that stood unassembled against the wall. She laid the quilt on a chaise longue. It was the only thing in this entire house that felt real, that held any part of her. It was a map of her heart. And in that moment, the decision was made. Not with panic, but with a terrifying, crystalline calm. She could not stay here. She could not wait for his solicitor and his discreet arrangements. She could not live as a gilded prisoner, her name whispered in scandal, her child's future hanging by the thread of his father's cold mercy. She would not be a faulty part to be discarded. She would be gone. She went to her writing desk and took out the small purse she used for household expenses. It contained 20 pounds, a fortune to some, a pittance to her. It would have to be enough. She changed out of her silk dress and into a simple, dark wool traveling suit, the plainest thing she owned. She braided her long hair and pinned it tightly to her head. Then she returned to the nursery. She picked up the quilt. Its familiar weight was a comfort. It was all she would take. No jewels, no fine clothes, no mementos of a life that had proven to be a lie. Just this, and the child growing within her. She did not use the grand staircase. She took the servants' stairs at the back of the house, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn wood. The air smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, the real smells of a house, not the perfumed pretense of the front rooms. No one saw her. No one stopped her. The Duchess of Blackwood, wrapped in a plain cloak, slipped out a side door into the rainy London night. She did not look back. She simply walked away, melting into the mist and the gaslight, leaving behind a title, a fortune, and a man made of stone. All she carried was a quilt, a pittance, and a secret that would define the rest of her life. The salt was in the air, in the stone, in her very bones. 7 years. 7 winters in Stonecross had scoured every last trace of the Duchess from her. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now chapped and strong from hauling laundry, mending fishing nets, and scrubbing floors. Her face was weathered by the relentless Cornish wind, and fine lines fanned from the corners of her eyes. She was no longer Eleanor Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood. She was Mrs. Alara Stone, a widow who had come to the coast for her health and stayed. A quiet, hard-working woman, unremarkable in every way. It was a harsh life, a life lived on the knife's edge of poverty, but it was hers. Her son, Thomas, was the sun around which her small world orbited. He was 6 years old, a whirlwind of lanky limbs and boundless curiosity. He had her dark hair, but his eyes were pure Blackwood, a startling, stormy gray that sometimes made her breath catch in her throat. They were a constant, painful, beloved reminder of the man who had cast them out. He knew nothing of dukes or London. His world was the rocky shoreline, the cry of gulls, the smell of drying nets, and the small, 2-room cottage they called home. His greatest treasure was the quilt. It was no longer the vibrant masterpiece she had fled with. 7 years of being a child's constant companion had taken their toll. It was faded, frayed at the edges, and patched in a dozen places with rough calico and homespun wool. The silks had lost their sheen, the velvets their plushness. But at its heart, the blackbird in the hawthorn tree remained, its silver thread tarnished, but its intricate stitching unbroken. It was Thomas's shield against nightmares, his tent for indoor adventures, his cloak when he played at being a king. It was also, she realized with a familiar pang of anxiety, their last resort. The winter had been cruel. A long bout of fever had kept her from her laundry work for 3 weeks, eating through their meager savings. Thomas was growing, his boots too small, his coat too thin. The rent was due. The gnawing fear that had been her constant companion for 7 years was growing louder, sharper. There was no other choice. "We are going to Penzance, my love," she told Thomas one morning, her voice brighter than she felt. His gray eyes lit up. "To the big market?" "To the very same." She had avoided the larger towns, preferring the anonymity of their small village, but Stonecross had no market to speak of, no one with coin to spare for a worn-out old quilt. Penzance was their only hope. She spent an hour carefully cleaning it, though there was little she could do about the fading and the patches. It felt like a betrayal, selling this last piece of her former life, this first gift to her son. She was selling her own heart. "But it's my quilt," Thomas said, his lip trembling as she folded it carefully into a canvas bag. She knelt and cupped his face in her hands. "I know, my darling, but we need to buy you new boots and food for the larder. Think of it as the quilt going on an adventure. It will find a new home, and it will keep someone else warm." He was not convinced, but he was a good boy. He nodded, his stormy eyes full of a sorrow that was far too old for his small face. The sight of it nearly broke her. The journey to Penzance on the public cart was cold and long. The town was a chaotic whirl of sights and sounds, a world away from the quiet rhythms of Stonecross. The market was a sprawling, noisy affair, crammed into the winding streets. The air was thick with the smell of fried fish, spiced apples, and damp humanity. Eleanor found a stall holder, a grim-faced woman selling assorted household goods, who agreed to display the quilt for a portion of the sale. Eleanor could not bear to stand there and watch, to haggle over the price of her own memories. She named a price, £5, a desperate, hopeful sum, and gave the woman the stall's fee in pennies. "I will return before the market closes," Eleanor said, her voice tight. She took Thomas by the hand and fled into the crowd, needing to put distance between herself and the act of betrayal. She bought him a hot meat pie with a few of her remaining coins, and they sat on the steps of the harbor, watching the ships. The sea air was cold, but the pie was warm. For a few moments, watching Thomas eat, his face alight with simple pleasure, she could almost pretend they were just a mother and son on a day out, with no fears chasing at their heels. But the fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach. What if it didn't sell? The question echoed with the cry of the gulls. What then? Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, hated markets. He hated the press of bodies, the noise, the smells. He was a man of order, of space, of silence. Yet for the past 3 years, he had spent more time in places like this than he had in the clubs of London. His life had become an empty echo chamber after Eleanor had left. The cavernous halls of Blackwood Manor, once merely quiet, had become tombs of silence. The London townhouse was unbearable, each room screaming her absence. Marcus had been triumphant at first, pushing a new bride-to-be at him, the vapid daughter of an earl. The engagement had been a disaster. The girl's simpering sweetness had grated on his nerves, and her presence had only highlighted the intelligent, quiet dignity of the woman he had lost. Doubt, at first a tiny seed, had begun to grow. He remembered the look on Eleanor's face. Not guilt. It was shock, a profound, shattering hurt. He remembered her calm, the way she had folded the quilt. He had thought it defiance. Now, in the lonely hours of the night, it looked more like resignation. He had started his own quiet investigation. He hired a man, a former Bow Street runner named Finch, a methodical, terrier-like man who specialized in discreet inquiries. For 2 years, Finch had found nothing. Eleanor had vanished as if into thin air. There were no accounts accessed, no jewels sold. It was as if the Duchess of Blackwood had simply ceased to exist. Then, 6 months ago, Finch had found the forger. A wretched man with a talent for mimicry and a weakness for gin, wasting away in a London slum. He confessed to being paid by Marcus Thorne to create a love letter in a passable imitation of a gentleman's hand. The evidence that had destroyed Alistair's life had been a £50 lie. The rage that filled Alistair was a cold, killing thing. He had confronted Marcus, not with fury, but with a quiet, lethal precision that had made his cousin tremble. Marcus had confessed, weeping, blaming his jealousy, his debts. Alistair had not banished him. That would be too easy. He had ruined him financially, cut him off from the family, and left him to twist in the wind, a social pariah. But punishing Marcus did not bring Eleanor back. It only sharpened the edges of his own guilt. He was the judge who had burned the evidence. He was the fool who had trusted the snake in his garden. He had done this. His pride, his arrogance, his coldness. He had broken the best thing in his life. Finch's investigation had pivoted. Now they were not just looking for a duchess. They were looking for a ghost. A faint trail, years old, led them to Cornwall. A woman matching her description, seen on a coach heading west, looking pale and alone. It was almost nothing, but it was all he had, so he traveled. He left the running of his estates to his managers and followed the slimmest of leads, his ducal carriage replaced by a hired coach, his fine clothes packed away in favor of a simple gentleman's traveling attire. He searched coaching inns, villages, and towns, showing a miniature of Eleanor, asking questions, his hope dwindling with each passing day, which was why he found himself in the noisy, chaotic market at Penzance, feeling the familiar weight of despair settle on his shoulders. He was about to turn and leave, to retreat to the sterile quiet of his inn-room, when his eye caught a flash of color. a swatch of deep blue velvet hanging over the side of a junk stall. He stopped. It was nothing, he told himself. Velvet was common enough, but there was something about the color, a particular shade that sparked a memory. He moved closer. The item was a quilt. It was old, faded, and heavily patched. A child's blanket, by the look of it. Worn and well-loved. He was about to dismiss it and walk away when he saw the center. His heart stopped. Time seemed to slow, the noise of the market fading to a distant hum. There, amidst the frayed patches and faded colors, was a blackbird in a hawthorn tree. The stitching was unmistakable, a unique, intricate pattern of tiny knots he had never seen anywhere else. He remembered her sitting by the fire, her head bent in concentration, her needle flashing. He remembered thinking it was a foolish waste of a Duchess's time. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and touched the worn fabric. It was real. "This quilt," he said, his voice hoarse. He turned to the woman running the stall. "Where did you get it?" The woman eyed his fine coat and the quality of his boots. "A seller brought it in this morning. Why? You interested?" "I am," he said, fighting to keep his voice even. "The woman who brought it. Can you describe her?" "Tallish, dark hair, plain-looking, sad eyes," the woman said with a shrug. "Looked like she needed the money. Said she'd be back before closing." Sad eyes, plain-looking. He remembered Eleanor's vibrant beauty, the light in her eyes he had so carelessly extinguished. Of course she would look different now. 7 years of hardship would change anyone. "Did she have anyone with her?" he pressed. "A little lad, 6, maybe 7 years old, clinging to her skirts." A child, the world tilted on its axis. A boy, 6 or 7 years old. The timeline was a perfect, brutal fit. His son, the heir he had never known, the child she had been protecting when she fled, the nausea he had seen on her face that last day. It had not been discussed. It was morning sickness. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. He was not just a fool. He was a monster. "How much for the quilt?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "She's asking £5. He pulled a thick wad of notes from his pocket and threw £10 on the stall's counter. "It's sold, and I will give you another £10 if you tell me which way she went." The woman's eyes widened at the sight of the money. She snatched it up and pointed a grimy finger toward the harbor. "Down that way. Said they were going to watch the ships." He did not wait for another word. He grabbed the quilt, clutching the worn, precious fabric in his fist, and he ran. He pushed through the crowds, ignoring the curses and indignant shouts. He ran toward the harbor, his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild, terrifying mix of hope and dread churning in his gut. He had found a piece of her. Now he had to find her. He had to find his son. He burst onto the harbor front, the wind whipping off the sea, tasting of salt and cold. He scanned the faces, the families, the sailors mending nets. And then he saw them. Sitting on the cold stone steps, their backs to him, were a woman in a dark cloak and a small boy. The boy was finishing a pie, and the woman was watching him with an expression of such fierce, tender love that it stole the breath from Alistair's lungs. Even from the back, he knew her. The set of her shoulders, the elegant line of her neck. Thinner, worn, but her. It was Eleanor. He took a step forward, then another. The boy turned his head at the sound of his boots on the cobblestones, and Alistair found himself staring into his own eyes. The same stormy gray, wide with a child's innocent curiosity. He stopped, the folded quilt in his hand, feeling impossibly heavy. Eleanor followed her son's gaze and slowly turned. Her face was pale, her expression guarded. Then her eyes landed on him, and all the color drained from her cheeks. Her lips parted in a silent gasp. The brief, fragile peace of her afternoon was shattered. The ghost had come back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They were separated by 20 feet of stone and 7 years of pain. The only sound was the cry of the gulls and the frantic, desperate beating of his own heart. He had found her, and in her son's face, he had found the devastating, absolute proof of his own monumental failure. Eleanor's first instinct was to run, to snatch Thomas's hand and disappear back into the anonymous life she had built, but her feet felt rooted to the cold stone. The sight of him, standing there against the gray sea, was so shocking, so utterly impossible, that it paralyzed her. He was older. The severe lines of his face had deepened, and there was a weariness in his posture she had never seen before, but he was still the Duke of Blackwood. Power clung to him like the expensive wool of his coat, and in his hand he held the quilt. Her quilt. The sight of it in his possession was a violation. He had no right. Thomas, oblivious, looked from the tall stranger to his mother's stricken face. "Mama? Who is that man?" The question broke the spell. Eleanor rose to her feet, instinctively moving to place herself between Alistair and her son. Her body was a shield. "He is no one," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Come, Thomas, we are leaving." Alistair took a step forward, his face a mask of complex emotions, pain, regret, and something else she couldn't name. "Eleanor, please." The sound of her name on his lips after so long was like a physical blow. "Do not," she hissed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You have no right to say my name. You have no right to be here." "The quilt," he said, his voice rough. "I saw it at the market." He held it out, a peace offering she had no intention of accepting. "I knew the stitching." "It was for sale," she said, her words clipped and cold. "Because my son needs boots for the winter, something you would know nothing about." The barb hit its mark. A muscle feathered in his jaw. His gaze dropped to Thomas, who was peering around her legs, his gray eyes wide. The resemblance was not just a suggestion, it was a proclamation. The boy was the image of Alistair at that age. Alistair's expression crumbled. The ducal mask fell away, and for a second she saw the man beneath, a man devastated, horrified, and utterly lost. "He is—" Alistair's voice failed him. He swallowed, trying again. "He is mine." It was not a question. It was a statement of dawning, catastrophic truth. "He is mine," she corrected him, her voice trembling with a rage that had simmered for 7 long years. "I raised him. I kept him safe. I kept him fed. He has never known a day of your care, or your money, or your name. He belongs to me." "Eleanor, I did not know." The plea in his voice was raw. "I swear to you, I did not know you were with child." She laughed, a bitter, ugly sound that echoed the one he had made in her drawing room an eternity ago. "And if you had known? What then, Your Grace? Would you have believed he was yours? Or would you have assumed he was the product of the affair you were so convinced of? Would you have torn him from me and raised him in that cold, silent mausoleum you call a home?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "No, it was a lie, Eleanor. All of it." "A lie?" she scoffed. "It was convenient, was it not? A perfect excuse to be rid of the inconvenient wife with the Vance fortune already secured." "That is not true." His voice rose, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. He lowered it again, his tone laced with desperation. "Marcus forged the letter. He confessed it. I have proof. I have been looking for you for years." Marcus. The name was a drop of poison, but even the news of his cousin's treachery could not breach the wall of ice around her heart. It was too little, too late. Alistair's betrayal was not in believing a lie. It was in his readiness to believe it. His lack of faith in her had been the true poison. "Proof?" she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "You burned the proof against me without a second thought. Forgive me if I no longer have any interest in your evidence. Your judgment is worthless to me." Thomas, sensing the volatile currents swirling around them, tugged on her skirt. "Mama, I'm cold. I want to go home." Her heart ached for him. This was his first exposure to the world she had fled, a world of adult pain and anger. "Of course, my love," she whispered, stroking his hair. She fixed Alistair with a glare that could have frozen the sea behind him. "Go back to London. Go back to your life and leave us to ours. We want nothing from you." She turned to leave, pulling Thomas with her. "Wait!" he called out, his voice cracking. "The boy! What is his name?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. A part of her, a vicious, wounded part, wanted to deny him even this. But she looked down at her son, who was watching the tall man with an unnerving intensity. "His name is Thomas." Alistair closed his eyes. Thomas. The name of his own father. A name she had chosen for the heir he had never known. The weight of it seemed to crush him. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority, but now it was tempered with a desperate resolve. "I will not lose you again. I will not lose him." "You have no choice," she retorted, not looking back. "You lost us 7 years ago." She walked away, her son's small hand held tightly in hers. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on them, a burning weight on her shoulders. She walked toward the cart that would take them back to Stonecross, back to their safe, anonymous world. But she knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that the walls of that world had just been breached. The Duke of Blackwood had found them, and a man like him did not give up. The journey back to Stonecross was a blur of misery. Thomas, exhausted and confused by the day's events, fell asleep against her side, his face peaceful. Eleanor wished she could find such a simple peace. Her mind was a maelstrom. Alistair's face, the pain in his eyes, his desperate words, they warred with 7 years of bitterness and hard-won independence. He said it was a lie. He said he had been looking for her. Did it matter? The damage was done. The trust was shattered. She had built a life here, a poor life, but a proud one. She had been Alara Stone for longer than she had been the Duchess of Blackwood. She did not want that ghost back in her life. When the cart rattled into the familiar, cobbled square of Stonecross, the evening was drawing in. The smell of wood smoke and the sea was a comfort. Mrs. Gable, the stout, kind-hearted owner of the village inn, was standing in her doorway. Her face, usually wreathed in a welcoming smile, was tight with concern. "Ilara, my dear," she said, bustling forward to help her down from the cart. "There's a gentleman. He arrived an hour ago. Took my best room." Eleanor's heart plummeted. She knew before Mrs. Gable even spoke another word. "A real lordly type," the innkeeper continued in a low voice, her eyes wide. "Paid for a week in advance with a gold sovereign and didn't even ask for the change. He's been asking questions about a woman and a boy." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice flat. She gathered the sleeping Thomas into her arms. He was getting too heavy for her, but she held on, needing the solid weight of him. "His name is Alistair Beaumont." She did not add the title. She could not. Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. She knew Eleanor's past was a closed book, and she had never pried, a kindness for which Eleanor was eternally grateful. But the name, combined with the man's aristocratic bearing, was clearly adding up to something spectacular. "Thank you for the warning, Mary," Eleanor said, her exhaustion a physical ache. "I must get Thomas to bed." She carried her son through the village's single street to their cottage. The small stone building, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt terribly fragile, exposed. As she fumbled with the key, she felt eyes on her. She looked up. He was standing across the street, a dark silhouette in the twilight, watching from outside the inn. He did not move, did not call out. He just stood there, a silent, imposing sentinel. She pushed the door open and hurried inside, barring it behind her. She leaned against the rough wood, her heart pounding. This was a siege. She put Thomas to bed in his small room, tucking the worn blankets around him. He didn't even stir. She lit a single candle in their main room and sank into a chair. The canvas bag from the market lay on the table, empty. She hadn't even gone back to the stall. She had left the quilt and the money. She had fled, and he had followed. He was not going to leave. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold stone. He had taken a room at the inn. He was planting himself here, in her world, whether she wanted him or not. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. It was the same ducal entitlement that had allowed him to condemn her without a trial. But his face on the harbor, that had not been arrogance. It had been agony. A knock came at the door. Not loud, but firm, unmistakable. She froze. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to sit in the dark and pretend she wasn't there. But that was the Duchess's response. Alara Stone was not a woman who hid. She had faced down illness, poverty, and loneliness. She would face this. She took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and opened it a crack. He stood on her doorstep, his tall frame filling the small space. The wind had tousled his dark hair, and in the flickering candlelight from her cottage, he looked less like a duke and more like a man at the end of a long, desperate road. He was holding the quilt. "You left this," he said quietly. "I have no use for it," she replied, her voice cold. "It served its purpose. It brought you here to torment me." "That was not my intention," he said. He looked past her, into the spare, clean poverty of her home. The simple wooden furniture, the mended crockery on the dresser, the faint smell of soap. It was a world away from the gilded cages he inhabited. His gaze was filled with a dawning shame. "Eleanor, may I come in? Just for 5 minutes, please." The please was what undid her. He was not a man who pleaded. He was a man who commanded. She hesitated, then swung the door open wider. 5 minutes. He stepped inside, and the small room seemed to shrink around him. He looked out of place, a hawk in a sparrow's nest. He carefully folded the quilt and placed it on her small wooden table. It looked impossibly vibrant against the plain wood. "I will not try to justify what I did," he began, his voice low and earnest. "There is no justification. I was a proud, arrogant fool. I let Marcus poison my mind because it was easier than confronting the distance between us. I failed you. In every way a husband can fail his wife." She stood by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. She said nothing. She had waited 7 years to hear these words. Now that they were here, they felt like echoes in an empty room. "I have the forger's confession," he continued, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a folded document. "And Marcus's. I brought them, not to excuse my actions, but to prove to you that the foundation of your exile was a deliberate, malicious lie." He held the papers out to her. She did not take them. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The lie was not the crime, Alistair. Your belief in it was." He let his hand fall. He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "Yes, you are right, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for that." He looked toward the closed door of Thomas's room. He is well?" "He is perfect," she said, a fierce, protective fire flaring in her chest. "No thanks to you." "I want to know him, Eleanor." "No." The word was sharp, absolute. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to sweep in here after 7 years of silence and play the father. He has a life here, a happy one." "A life of poverty," he countered, a flash of his old arrogance breaking through. "He is my son. He is the heir to a dukedom. He should not be living in a hovel. worrying about whether he will have boots for the winter. "This hovel has been more of a home to him than Blackwood Manor ever could be," she shot back, her voice rising. "It is filled with love, not silence and servants. He is not a title, Alistair. He is a little boy, and you will not hurt him. I will not let you." The fire in her caught him off guard. This was not the quiet, reserved Duchess he remembered. This was a lioness, forged in the crucible of hardship. And he found, to his astonishment, that he admired her for it. He loved her for it. "I would never hurt him," he said softly. "Or you. Not again. I swear it." "Your swears are worthless." The impasse was absolute. They stood in the flickering candlelight, two strangers bound by a past that would not let them go. "I am not leaving Stonecross," he said finally, his voice thick with resolve. "You can bar your door. You can refuse to speak to me. But I will be here. I will live at the inn. I will wait, for as long as it takes." He turned and walked out of the cottage, leaving the door open behind him. He did not take the quilt. It remained on her table, a silent testament to everything they had lost, and the one fragile thing that had brought them back together. Eleanor sank into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She stared at the quilt, at the intricate blackbird, its stitching still perfect. He had said he would wait. She did not believe him. Men like Alistair did not wait. They took. But as the days turned into a week, he proved her wrong. He did not approach her again. He did not try to force his way into her life. But he was there, a constant, quiet presence in the village. He kept his room at the inn, much to Mrs. Gable's flustered delight. The villagers, at first suspicious of the grand stranger, slowly grew accustomed to the sight of him. He did not act like a duke. He walked the shoreline, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the gray, churning sea. He spoke politely to the fishermen. He bought a round of ale for the quarrymen at the inn one evening, listening to their stories without a hint of condescension. Eleanor watched him from a distance, her heart a confused, aching knot. This was a man she did not know. This humble, patient man was a stranger. One morning she woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. She looked out her small window and saw him in the yard behind her cottage. He had removed his fine coat and rolled up the sleeves of his pristine white shirt. He was chopping the pile of driftwood she had been slowly collecting, splitting it into perfectly sized logs for her hearth. His movements were efficient, powerful. She threw on her shawl and marched outside. "What do you think you are doing?" He stopped, leaning the axe against the chopping block. Sweat beaded on his brow. "Your woodpile was low. The mornings are getting colder." "I am perfectly capable of chopping my own wood." "I have no doubt," he said, his gaze steady. "But my hands are idle. Allow me this, please." She wanted to refuse, to send him away, but the sight of him there, performing such a simple, menial task for her, disarmed her. It was so far removed from the man who had dismissed her with a wave of his hand. She gave a curt, reluctant nod and retreated back inside, her cheeks burning. The next day a pony and cart arrived from Penzance. It was laden with supplies, not luxuries, but necessities. Sacks of flour and potatoes, salted meat, 2 pairs of sturdy new boots for Thomas, and a thick, warm woolen coat. There was also a beautifully crafted wooden toy soldier. They were left on her doorstep. There was no note. When she saw Alistair later, walking near the cliffs, she confronted him. "I cannot accept these things." "They are not for you," he said calmly. "They are for my son. I will not have him go without. You can burn them if you wish, but I will only send more." His logic was infuriating and unassailable. Thomas was his son. He had a right to provide for him. To refuse would be to punish Thomas out of her own pride. She hated him for it, and for the flicker of gratitude she felt. Thomas, of course, was delighted with the gifts. He adored the new boots and marched around the cottage, the toy soldier held tightly in his hand. "The tall man gave it to me," he announced one afternoon. Eleanor's head snapped up. "What tall man? When did you speak to him?" "Today, by the boats. He asked my name. I told him. He has eyes like me, Mama." Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "Is he my papa?" The question she had dreaded for 6 years. She sat down and pulled him onto her lap. "It's complicated, my love." "He looks sad," Thomas said, his childish observation cutting straight to the heart of it. "I think he misses his little boy." That evening, as a storm rolled in off the sea, lashing the cottage with wind and rain, a frantic knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, her face pale with worry. "It's the boy, Thomas," she said, breathless. "The Duke sent me. He saw him playing near the old sea wall just before the storm hit. A wave came over. He was swept. The Duke went in after him." Eleanor's world dissolved into a roar of terror. She ran, heedless of the wind that tore at her hair and the rain that soaked her through. She ran toward the sea wall, her heart screaming her son's name. The scene was chaos. Fishermen were shouting, pointing into the churning, violent waves. And there, in the maelstrom, she saw them. Alistair, his body a bulwark against the fury of the sea, was holding Thomas, keeping his head above the water. He was fighting his way back to shore, inch by inch, against a current that was trying to drag them both out to sea. He was going to die. He was going to die saving the son he had only just met. 2 fishermen with a rope waded into the surf. They managed to reach Alistair, to get the rope around him. With a monumental effort, they hauled the 3 of them back onto the shingle. Eleanor fell to her knees beside them. Thomas was coughing, sputtering, but alive, terrified, but alive. Alistair lay on the wet stones, his chest heaving, his face bruised and bleeding from where he'd been slammed against the rocks. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a desperate, pleading question. "He's all right," she sobbed, clutching Thomas to her. "You saved him. You saved him." They carried Alistair back to the inn. He had a broken arm and several cracked ribs, but he was alive. Eleanor, after putting a warm, dry Thomas to bed, went to him. She sat by his bedside all night, bathing his face, listening to the ragged sound of his breathing. In the gray light of dawn, he woke. He saw her sitting there, and his eyes filled with tears. "Is he—" "He's fine," she whispered. "He's sleeping. He asked for you." Alistair closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I almost lost him." "But you didn't," she said, her voice thick. She reached out and took his uninjured hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "You saved him, Alistair." In that moment, in the quiet, storm-battered room, the ice around her heart finally cracked. The 7 years of bitterness, the pride, the anger, they didn't vanish, but they receded, making way for something new, something fragile and tentative. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. "Rest," she said softly. "I will be here when you wake up." She stayed. She nursed him, changing his bandages and bringing him broth. She sat with him while he slept, and they talked. Not about the past, not at first. They talked about Thomas. She told him about his first word, his first steps, his love for the sea. Alistair listened, his face a study in wonder and regret. One afternoon, she brought the quilt from the cottage and spread it over him. "You should have this," she said. He touched the intricate stitching of the blackbird. "You made this for him." "I made it for the hope of him," she corrected gently. "In a life that had no hope." "I will never forgive myself for that," he said, his voice raw, "for being the cause of that hopelessness." "Perhaps," she said, meeting his gaze, "it is time we both learned to forgive." A few weeks later, when Alistair was well enough to travel, a carriage arrived in Stonecross. It was not the ostentatious ducal coach, but a simple, sturdy traveling carriage. With it was Finch, the Bow Street runner, and another man, pale and trembling. Alistair, his arm still in a sling, summoned Eleanor to the inn's private parlor. "There is one last piece of business," he said, his face grim. "I wanted you to witness it." He had lured Marcus to Cornwall on the pretense of a financial reconciliation. His cousin, desperate and ruined, had come willingly. He now stood before Alistair, his face a mask of disbelief as Finch laid out the proof of the forgery and conspiracy. "You destroyed my life," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You exiled my wife and stole 7 years of my son's life from me. For what? For money? For a title you could never have?" Marcus fell to his knees, babbling apologies, begging for mercy. Eleanor watched, feeling nothing but a distant pity for this broken, pathetic man. He held no more power over her. "He will face justice," Alistair said, turning to her. "But his fate is not for me to decide alone. What do you want done with him, Eleanor?" He was giving her the power he had once so carelessly wielded against her. She looked at Marcus, weeping on the floor, and then back at Alistair, who was watching her with quiet respect. "I want him gone," she said simply. "I never want to see his face or hear his name again. That is all." Alistair nodded to Finch. Marcus was escorted out, his fate to be a quiet, permanent exile to the colonies, his name erased from the family records. The final ghost of the past had been exorcised. That evening Alistair came to the cottage. He did not ask to come in, but stood on the doorstep. "We are leaving in the morning," he said. I have had the nursery at Blackwood aired and cleaned. I thought, perhaps Thomas would like to see his home." He was not commanding. He was asking. He was not talking about her or them. He was focused on their son. "And what of me?" she asked softly. He looked at her, and all the love and regret of the past 7 years was in his eyes. "Eleanor, I am asking you to come home. Not as my Duchess, if you do not wish it, but as my wife, my partner, my equal. Blackwood is nothing without you. I am nothing without you. Come home and help me build a life of hope, not silence." She looked past him, at the village that had been her sanctuary, at the sea that had been her solace. She had found her strength here. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled into the night. She could stand on her own, and because of that, she was finally free to choose. She looked at her son, who was standing in the doorway behind her, watching them with his wise, gray eyes. He smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "Yes," she said, a real smile touching her own lips for the first time in a very long time. "Yes, Alistair. Let's go home." The return to Blackwood Manor was not a return to the past. The great house was the same, but they were different. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the long corridors. Alistair was a changed man. The ducal arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility, a constant, gentle attentiveness to her and to Thomas. He was not just a duke, he was a husband and a father. He courted her again, with small kindnesses, shared laughter, and a profound respect for the woman she had become. One evening she found him in the nursery. He was standing by the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds. Thomas was asleep in the small bed, the old, faded quilt tucked around him. The room was warm and bright, filled with toys and books. "I was thinking," Alistair said, turning to her, "about this room, about how you were preparing it, while I was blind." "We were both blind," she said, coming to stand beside him. She slipped her hand into his. "But now we see." He brought her hand to his lips. "I love you, Eleanor. more than I knew how to say, more than I deserved. "I love you, Alistair," she replied, her heart full. They stood there for a long time, in the quiet of the nursery, their son sleeping peacefully under the tattered, beautiful map of their journey. The house was no longer a cage, but a home. The silence had been filled with love. The past had been atoned for, the future a shared and hopeful promise. The blackbird in the hawthorn tree, once a symbol of a cold legacy, was now a testament to a love that had been lost, fought for, and finally, blessedly, found.